As the final class of Imperial German battlecruisers to be completed, the Derfflinger class shows the ultimate evolution in the type. The combination of heavy armor, fast speed, and enough firepower, taken to the best conclusion Germany could afford at that time. The result was a very well designed and balanced class of ships that gave good performance and actual service. For all of that, though, these ships would see fairly limited service. Only the name ship herself, Derfflinger, would see more than one proper battle. One can even argue she's the only one to see more than a year of proper service, because both of her sisters would have very short service lives. A fairly quiet one for Hindenburg, and one that ended in the firestorm of Jutland for Lützow. But for now, let's focus on the class's design and the name ship. Design work on what would become Derfflinger began in 1910. Initially given the designation Große Kreuzer K, Derfflinger was intended as the GK of the 1911 production year under the 4th Naval Law. As is fairly typical of ship design, her design process had begun well before the ship was actually authorized. Several different iterations were thought up, though a general theme did remain here. Increasing firepower. While there were some discussions about making her a sister to Große Kreuzer J, that is, Seydlitz, those didn't go anywhere. The increase in firepower was incredibly important to the German fleet, as the British began to put out their 13.5-inch armed battlecruisers. Furthermore, their battleships were gaining in armor as well. While the older 11-inch, 28cm guns on the previous GK designs were functional and perfectly sufficient for dealing with the older British battlecruisers, they were still becoming somewhat outclassed. Now, the exact shape and layout these new guns would take was heavily debated, ranging from the same layout as the last two designs to going all the way back to von der Tann's layout. The caliber of the guns was equally as divisive. While certainly acknowledged that the older guns were insufficient, it was still a trial to convince everyone involved to jump to 30.5cm, 12-inch guns. There was, at one point, even an argument made to not make the jump because battleships and cruisers shouldn't have the same guns. At least according to staff, anyway. In any case, even once the caliber was decided upon, there was still a desire to, as an example, fit 5 twin turrets to the ship. It was only relatively late in the process that the decision to settle on 4 all centerline turrets was accepted. This was still an increase in both actual firepower, bigger guns, and effective firepower, as unlike previous designs, all the guns could fire on either broadside, without issue. With her design more or less finalized at this point, Derfflinger would still have one more thing done to her that would set her apart from her sisters. While she had not inherited von der Tann's turret layout, she would end up being stuck with the Fromm anti-roll tanks in spite of, let's say, less than ideal performance reports from the older ship. As the name would suggest, these were intended to reduce the roll of a ship at sea. On von der Tann, they only managed about a 33% reduction. Considering the amount of space and tonnage these things took up, you could say that was not really worth it. In the case of Derfflinger, this was something like 300 tons, a lengthening of the citadel, and about 500,000 extra marks on her cost, in addition to losing 2 of her secondary guns. Why the Germans went ahead with this in spite of the poor reports? Well, the most probable answer is simply that they waited too long into the design process to make a decision, while still operating on a prepare to install them kind of logic. As such, by the time the decision had been made, the design was too far along to remove them, and funding was already secured. Therefore, Derfflinger would have the anti-roll tanks, but they would be removed from Lützow and later Hindenburg. They weren't even planned, as far as I've been able to see, to be included on those 2 ships. One can make a good argument they weren't even really necessary, as the class, including Derfflinger, gained a reputation as fairly stable ships, even without using the tanks. That being said, it also wouldn't be the only change, as each of these ships were laid down far enough apart from one another that each one has some distinct quirks of their own. With that out of the way for now, though, we can look at the actual technical bits of the ships. The aforementioned 4 twin turrets carrying 30.5cm 12-inch guns. These were mounted on the center line with a superfiring pair on the bow and a near superfiring pair on the stern. This would result in ships with a layout somewhat similar to that of Tiger or Congo, though not identical. The new layout was far superior to previous German GK designs and allowed for firing all 8 guns on either broadside, saving the weight of an extra turret to get a heavier broadside thanks to the new guns. As for the secondary battery, well, Derfflinger was fitted with 12 15cm 5.9-inch guns and casement mountings. These were higher up in the superstructure instead of in the hull, which made them more functional in seas that weren't flat calm with no waves. Still not exactly the funnest position to serve in, but not drowning the crews in wave water either. As mentioned, Derfflinger lost 2 guns to fit the anti-roll tanks, so this is one noted difference with her compared to her sisters. Both Lutzow and Hindenburg would be fitted with 14 of the guns, though there were some discussions during the design process to give the latter ship even more secondary guns. If I'm remembering correctly, it was up to 18 at one point. The rest of the initial loadout, at least on Derfflinger, is rounded out by a smattering of 88mm guns, both anti-surface and anti-air mounts, along with the obligatory Dreadnought-era underwater torpedo tubes. In this case, 4 of them, mounted to cover all angles. 1 buried in the bow, 1 at the stern, and 1 on either side of the ship. Derfflinger, in another difference from her sisters, carried 50cm torpedoes, while her sisters carried heavier 60cm weapons, though the layout remained the same. All of this firepower was carried on a hull 210 meters, 690 feet long, with a beam of 29 meters, 95 feet. Hindenburg, in one of her more notable deviations, is slightly longer than her sisters at 212 meters. This would also result in her displacing slightly more at 27,000 tons normal and 31,500 tons at full load. Derfflinger, meanwhile, was 26,600 tons at standard and 31,200 at full load. Speed with these ships, on the other hand, is something that's pretty difficult to answer, as all 3 sisters had different performances here, likely as not due to different conditions on their sea trials. Derfflinger and Lutzow were both designed for 63,000 shaft horsepower, while Hindenburg was uprated to about 72,000. This was done with a mix of 14 coal-fired boilers and 4 oil-fired ones. There were some discussions of going to a purely oil-fired power plant, but those went nowhere due to very reasonable concerns about maintaining a supply of oil in wartime. There was also a plan, for a while, of sticking them with 3 shafts instead of 4. 2 powered traditionally, and a centerline shaft powered by a diesel engine, showing that the German Navy's fascination with diesel-powered capital ships goes quite a bit further back than you may think. This would not end up happening due to issues with the diesel engine. As such, the ships retain the 4-shaft arrangement. All of the ships would wildly exceed their designed horsepower on trials, ranging from 75,000 horsepower on Derfflinger to nearly 95,000 on Hindenburg. This did not, however, translate to a massive increase in speed. All of them came in more or less at their design speed, though generally slower than anticipated. This could be laid at the feet of how their sea trials were performed, though the usual caveats of trial power and speed being unusual for actual service apply here. As a general rule, the ships managed somewhere in the realm of 26 knots each. Sometimes more like 25.5, sometimes more like 26.6, but generally in that 25 to 27 knot range. In theory, these ships could probably manage something like 28 or 29 knots in the best case scenario, though by no means would that be a reliable speed for them to keep up. And to wrap this section up, the armor protection. This doesn't need a lot of elaboration, as it is more or less the exact same as sidelets, a 300mm 12-inch main belt that thinned down towards the bow and stern. Torpedo protection was a 45mm, 1.8-inch torpedo bulkhead. Deck protection, not as important in those days, ranged from 30mm to 80mm, 3.1 inches, in important parts of the ship. With that all out of the way, we can go back to service history. Derfflinger, the only one of the ships ordered as new construction and not a replacement for an existing ship, was laid down on March 30th, 1912, and she would have been launched on June 14th, 1913, with a General August von Mackensen, who will lend his name to the next class of German GKs, giving a speech during it. Derfflinger proceeded to go, "No, I rather like my place, thank you." The wooden sledges the ship rested on jammed. As a result, she would only move about 40 centimeters on that first launch attempt. Probably incredibly embarrassed by this, the launch was attempted again and failed again. It would only be after completely removing one of the sledges that Derfflinger would be properly launched almost an entire month later on July 12, 1913. As this was still peacetime, if an admittedly tense peacetime, Derfflinger was predicted to finish fitting out on September 13, 1914, and enter service by October 1st. This was because Kaiser Wilhelm wanted her to be present for the opening of the Panama Canal and following festivities. As it is, a certain Archduke being shot rather ruined that plan. With the Great War breaking out, Derfflinger's construction was accelerated, even though it was a bit of a rush job. Her overall construction would be finished fairly quickly in August 1914, though she would still only enter proper service on September 1st, which is admittedly a month ahead of schedule. It rather helped that her crew was drawn from men serving previously on older armored cruisers. Her trials wouldn't go quite as well, as damage to turbines occurred on 2 separate occasions. Luckily, this is rather the point of sea trials, working out kinks like this before the ship is actually in service. On that note, her initial service began fairly slow, all things being considered. She would join with 1st Scouting Group, Germany's primary GK squadron, on November 19th. Exercises with the other ships would take most of the remainder of 1914, with a break on the 15th of December to go shoot up the British coast a bit. This was one of many raids on the British Isles, though this particular encounter would not see action between the opposing fleets. The closest the British came to finding the German GKs were some very waterlogged destroyers in heavy seas on the 16th of December. Derfflinger wouldn't have to wait long for actual combat, though. For on January 24th, 1915, came the Battle of Dogger Bank. This was an interesting engagement. Derfflinger would prove so eager to engage the British that at one point she moved out of line and had to be ordered back into formation. Presumably coming back into line like a chastised and overeager puppy, she would manage to avoid any significant damage in the battle to come. When the British and German fleets properly engaged one another, Derfflinger would use her fire largely on HMS Lion, starting something of a theme of Lion getting beaten up on by Derfflinger-class ships. The British, meanwhile, ended up focusing the vast majority of their fire on the poor armored cruiser Blücher, the least effective and most outdated of the German forces. This would result in her sinking, though due to signaling errors and Lion being taken out of the fight, the British would focus fire on her for far longer than necessary. Lucky for the Germans, really, in that they would only lose 1 armored cruiser in spite of pretty severe damage to sidelets. Derfflinger, for her part, would escape with only 1 damaging hit after kicking Lion around. One of her shells actually hit Lion on the waterline and penetrated her belt, which, if anything, is an indication that the increase in gun caliber was worth the effort. Derfflinger's own damage from her 1 hit amounted to just a couple armor plates being dented in and some flooding in her coal bunkers. Repairs to this damage, along with general refits, would take place over the remainder of January and into February. In fact, Derfflinger would spend a large portion of 1915 in and out of various refits, along with fairly mundane duties in safe waters. It's telling that one of the most exciting things to happen to her is breaking some of her turbines, again, on June 28th, wherein she almost rammed a battleship because her bow snapped around at slow speed. The sudden shift to full astern power shredded one of the low-pressure turbines. Repairs and modifications because of this would take until the end of August. The rest of 1915 and the early portion of 1916 passed largely without incident. She had some mishaps like running aground or tangling her propellers, but those were pretty minor, all told. It wouldn't be until the bombardment of Yarmouth on April 24, 1916, that she saw actual combat again. If minor combat, as save for mine damage to the unfortunate sidelets, the Germans mostly just shot up the British coast again. They did fire on some cruisers at one point, though, severely damaging HMS Conquest. Following this, while the Germans would like to go on to fight the British immediately, the damage to one of their GKs prevented this. It wouldn't be until the end of May that the High Seas Fleet sortied again. The resultant Battle of Jutland is a very well-trodden topic. I will, as such, focus on Derfflinger's own role, as I will, at a later date, focus on Lützow's. When the British battlecruisers and German Grossekreuzers entered direct conflict with one another late in the afternoon of May 31st, Derfflinger would initially live a charmed life. Signaling errors on the part of the British would see fire that should have been directed at her, instead being focused on Moltke. This allowed Derfflinger to more or less have free rein to fire on Princess Royal, landing several hits during the start of the battle. When that battlecruiser left the action, Derfflinger shifted fire to Queen Mary instead. In this, she was joined by sidelets, the combined fire of the two battlecruisers, soon leading to Queen Mary violently exploding. This would be the first time, though not the last, that Derfflinger contributed to a British battlecruiser detonating spectacularly. While engaged with other British ships, battleships of 5th Battle Squadron included, Derfflinger continued to dodge major damage. A couple hits from the battleships, possibly Barham, did do some damage to her bow, including detaching 2 of her 100mm armor plates, letting in about 300 tons of water. This early damage wouldn't slow her down much, though much more severe damage would come later. Before that, she would notch her second British battlecruiser. Derfflinger and Lützow, the most advanced German GKs, fired on Invincible, the first battlecruiser. While Invincible returned accurate fire, and quite possibly dealt the fatal blows to Lützow, Derfflinger would likely be the ship that fired the salvo that blew Invincible apart. This second catastrophic explosion would be avenged by the British. Derfflinger, at the head of the German formation by this point, would take rapid-fire hits from the British, somewhere between 20 to 30 hits between heavy and secondary guns, though numbers vary. This includes 15-inch shells from the Queen Elizabeths. At one point in the battle, all of her main battery was knocked out of action. Unlike her unfortunate sister ship, though, Derfflinger would ultimately survive the battle. She was so badly damaged from those hits, though, that she was out of service until October 15th. Her sheer stubbornness would gain her the nickname Iron Dog from the British, one of the relatively rare cases of an entirely positive nickname from an enemy. In common with much of the High Seas Fleet at this point, Derfflinger would not see very much combat for the rest of the war. She would make abortive sorties, she would run training operations, and she would remain as part of a fleet in being, tying down the Grand Fleet. But never again would she fight a grand battle with the Allied fleets. About the most exciting thing to happen to her was a refit that gave her a distinctive, and very massive, tripod mast. This would bring her in line with Hindenburg. With the end of the war, however, came the same fate as the rest of the Imperial German fleet. Derfflinger would be interned in Scapa Flow, and subsequently scuttled alongside her sister and the other warships. There she would remain until 1939, being the last of the High Seas Fleet capital ships to be raised out of the water. Of course, since World War II was soon to kick off, she would remain afloat upside down after being towed off. She would, in fact, still be floating capsized until 1946. This gives her the dubious honor of being afloat upside down longer than she had been afloat right side up. Rubbing further salt in the wounds, it would be an ex-German floating dry dock that took her to be scrapped. This process would complete in 1948, bringing an end to the long life of the Iron Dog. One of her bells would, eventually, be returned to the West German Navy on August 30th, 1965. The other one remains in British hands, specifically at a Scottish Catholic church. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.